Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode. My name is Christina and today we are going through chapter 8 of this book, The Baby Whisperer Solves All Your Problems by Tracy Hogg. Chapter 8 is all about taming toddlers, so we're mostly focusing on emotions in our children from ages 1 to 3. So Tracy's main point in this chapter is that it's important that we teach our children to be emotionally fit. And FIT is an acronym, F-I-T. We'll go over that in a little bit, but just the phrase emotionally fit completely applies to this situation. We're going to experience tantrums in our children, and we're going to experience the terrible twos and all of that stuff. And so this can be a difficult time to navigate for a lot of parents. Especially once we've mastered eating and sleeping, we might feel like we have our child down, and then it seems like their emotions just completely change and they become so much more complex. So it's important that we take the time with them during this age to sit down and teach them our actions can be good or bad, to teach them how to discern between right and wrong, and how to deal with the emotions that come with learning those things. What we experience with a lot of children between ages 1 and 3 is something called runaway emotions. And usually our child encounters a situation or something happens where they can't manage the emotions that they're feeling, and so they kind of explode, they blow up. It might turn into a tantrum, it might turn into something else. It might feel like everything has just gone way too far and we don't know how to backtrack and rewind and teach them the appropriate response. When it comes to runaway emotions, there are 4 risk factors that Tracy lays out that can impact if our child tends to have more runaway emotions than other children. The first is our child's temperament and also their emotional or social style. So with temperaments, we looked at that in an earlier chapter. There's angel, textbook, grumpy, touchy, and spirited babies. So spirited babies usually tend to be the ones that are more active and running around. They can boss people around, get their way. So you might think that they are the ones who are more likely to have runaway emotions. But we also have to take our child's social style into account, and that's something that changes as they grow as well. So we might expect that angel and textbook babies are all easygoing. You could even have an easygoing spirited baby as well. You could have a spirited baby that gets along well with other children, and you could have an angel baby who's a little more selfish, a little more reclusive, a little more reserved. You also just can assess their style by looking at if they tend to be more assertive in social situations, if they're more reactive to things that happen, and if they're really sensitive, if things tend to bother them pretty quickly. So the way that we can help manage this risk factor is by understanding our child's temperament and their social style, and to help not put them in situations where they would have a difficult time adjusting and adapting and really enjoying themselves. It's a skill we have to learn to adapt to act in our child's interest and not in our own. So even if we might want to take them to, say, like story time at the library, if they can't sit still and if they'd be a distraction for other children, we need to put them into a situation where they can let off their steam, they can wiggle a little bit, but where they can actually learn how to behave well and have fun doing it. The second risk factor are environmental factors. So like I just mentioned, if our child just needs to let off some steam, if they need to run around, we don't want to put them in a situation where they need to be careful and not touch things. We just want to be aware that maybe they just need to go outside and play for a little bit rather than sit down and be quiet somewhere. Also, being in a home where things aren't child-proofed can be very difficult for a child because they'll be told no a lot, and that can be something really frustrating depending on our child's temperament. So I would assume most of our homes are to some extent child-proofed, but if we're going to a friend's house or even a family member's house and they don't have young children, then there are going to be a lot more boundaries that will be difficult for them to navigate, especially if it's for the first time. So if we know that our child will get easily frustrated, then we want to take precautions to child-proof the environment that they are going to be in, whether that's putting away breakable things, getting things out of their level of being able to grab, possibly covering outlets, guarding off stairs, things like that. Additionally, changes in the family kids really pick up on. So if mom and dad are going through a divorce or a difficult time in their marriage, even though your child's only 2 years old, they can pick up on the emotions of that. And so even if they're not involved in the conversations or if there's any arguments going on, they still can tell that there's tension in the family, and that can be difficult for them. So to the best of our ability, we need to be able to change the factors that are upsetting them and just remind ourselves that our children are very emotionally in tune with our emotions, and that they can just pick up on little things. Even if someone is going through grief, for example, if you have a parent or a friend who passes away, and your child didn't even really know them, they can be affected by your grief and the way that you manage that. So just be aware of the way that you're acting around your child and how that can really affect their environment. The third risk factor is developmental issues. So that can be things like separation anxiety, not having the language skills enough to communicate, going through the dreaded twos, teething, even learning how to walk for the first time. Those things can all kind of change a child's temperament and their behavior a little bit. We can't stop these things from happening. They are developmental. We want them to happen. We don't want to hold our child back from developing and growing up, but we need to be watching for these things to understand how teething might affect our child's social behavior, or how not having language skills can make them more frustrated in other situations. It's also important that we don't use these things as excuses. If we're taking our child into an environment where they are having a difficult time because they're teething and they're in pain, we shouldn't be using the teething as an excuse. If we were aware that they were teething, then we shouldn't have done that action. And that kind of leads us into our fourth factor, which is actually the parents and our actions and our choices. I think this is probably the hardest thing, but this is really what she covers for the rest of the chapter. So it's our behavior when we're dealing with our child, if we're a subjective parent or an objective parent, if we're inconsistent with the methods and the discipline that we use, but also our interaction with each other. So if I'm constantly arguing with my husband, if we don't agree with the way that we should be raising our child, and if we're not both preparing our child for social situations that might be difficult, then our child is gonna have a hard time. There's also the idea of the double standard. So if we give our child rules in the home that don't apply to the outside world, or vice versa, where they're not allowed to do some things in the outside world that they are allowed to do at home, they're gonna have a hard time. So if we take them to a friend's house and they start jumping on the couch because they're allowed to do that at home, then we're going to be upset and embarrassed that they're jumping on our friend's couch, but they don't have an understanding of the difference between the couches and the homes. They just think the couch is a thing that you jump on. It also can be difficult for our children when we don't prepare them emotionally. We know where we're taking them, we know where we're going, if we're going to the doctors, if we're going to a new play group, even if we're just going to the grocery store. We need to let our children have time to be prepared. Even if it's just as little as telling them where we're going, or if you need to sit down with them and give them time to transition between going somewhere, then that can actually make all the difference when it comes to them being in new situations. I mentioned just a few seconds ago that we could be subjective or objective parents, and I just wanted to take a look at her book for this explanation. It's on page 309. There's just a small little chart here where it compares subjective parents to objective parents, and she does go into this a little bit more. Subjective parents are usually parents who identify with their child's emotions. They react from within, so they let their own emotions get in the way of disciplining their child. They might even feel guilty easily because of the things the child says or does, or even just when your child is crying or upset, that might be something that you feel. A subjective parent might also really rationalize and explain their child's behavior. We really want to avoid cop-out situations like saying, oh, she's just grumpy today. We need to understand our children more. It could just be that they're just grumpy today, but if they are grumpy today, we shouldn't put them in situations where they're gonna have a difficult time. We need to take responsibility for our own actions and say, she was grumpy, but I decided to put her in the situation anyway, and that's on me, but not be guilty and emotional about it. Subjective parents don't investigate their child's behavior. So when there is a problem, we don't know why our child is acting up in public, we need to look at the clues that led up to that. And a subjective parent won't do that. They'll just look at the isolated incident and maybe be frustrated by it. They might react emotionally. They might just be like, I don't want anything to do with this. But we need to look at everything leading up to what happened to actually understand our child and to prevent the behavior from happening again. Say like a tantrum comes up in the middle of a grocery store, we might accidentally, as a subjective parent, allow our child to think that that's okay to do. If we're not actually intentionally sitting down with them and explaining to them the correct behavior, then we're actually teaching them that those behaviors are okay. The last thing subjective parents do is praise their child excessively. We shouldn't be praising them when they're doing something that's expected of them. If we're telling them not to do something and they obey us, we can say, good job, you obeyed us. But if there's something very simple, like even just playing with their toys, there's no need for praise with that. That's just something babies do and toddlers. Objective parents, comparatively, will see their child as a separate being who's not apart from them. They will not relate their emotions to their child. If their child is upset, they will not get upset. They will base their reaction on the situation that is happening and not on their child's emotions. They gather evidence and they look for clues for things that can explain their child's behavior. They actually take the time to sit down and explain to the child what the wrong behavior is and what the correct response was. And in that, they're teaching emotional skills to their child and teaching their child how to live with consequences. And lastly, they also use praise appropriately to child train and to teach skills. So not every parent is subjective all the time. We can even notice that in some situations we tend to be subjective and in others we tend to be objective. And it's on us to figure out what we need to change about ourselves and about our perspective in order to best help our child and to be more objective in those situations. I know for sure I've experienced situations where I've become very frustrated with my daughter while she was frustrated, and I've become subjective even though I knew that I needed to not be. It was difficult. I was just having a difficult day, a difficult time, but I was able to reflect on that situation, recognize that I was being subjective, and now I know if I am in that situation again, the correct response is something other than what I did. A lot of that objective parenting had to do with teaching your child the correct response. And so that's what we're going to look at here. That's her acronym F.I.T for being emotionally fit. So we're going to look at F first. F is feeling. It's important that when something comes up with our child that we first acknowledge the feeling. We don't want to write off the feeling. We don't want to ignore the feeling that they're experiencing. This is an opportunity for us to teach them what this feeling is. And so I think what we come across the most as parents is probably frustration, especially as our child does become more emotionally advanced. So we can explain to them, you're frustrated. So we want to acknowledge them. We want to say, hey, I see that you're experiencing this emotion. This is frustration, and I understand why you might be feeling that right now. And that will help them name the thing that they're feeling. It'll help them make sense of the situation that they're experiencing as well, so that it won't be just kind of some foreign thing that takes over their body and causes them to have a runaway emotion. Instead, they say, oh, this is frustration, and I'm frustrated because somebody took my toy. Then the I is intervene. So if from that frustration, from a toy being taken, our child decides to slap the child who took it, we need to actually physically intervene at this point. So we can say, hey, you're frustrated, but we do not hit. And if your child is young enough, this is what I do with my daughter right now. If she does kind of hit me, it might not even be frustration. It could just be because she thinks it's fun. I'll grab her hand physically and be like, we don't hit. That hurts me, but you can touch my face and you can be really gentle. And I physically move her hand on my face and show her what it's like to be gentle. And I say gentle. So she kind of associates what being gentle actually means. And she'll practice rubbing my face afterwards. And it's a behavior I have to enforce a lot. And I'm aware that that's something she might struggle with in a social situation since she does it to me at home. So when she is playing with other children and she might become frustrated, I try to be physically close to her to keep her from hitting. So if I do see her winding up or anything, I can grab her and say, no, we don't do that. Depending on the child, I would probably have her not touch them. So whatever the behavior is that you want to stop, you need to stop it physically, and you need to teach them what not to do with their hands and also what to do with them. And that's going to be T, the T in fit, so telling them. So tell them what you expect from them and what they should do instead. So no, we don't hit, we're gentle with people. What you should do, if your child can speak is ask for the toy back. Tell them that you're frustrated that they took your toy and ask for it back. If they're not old enough to communicate, it might be better to kind of subvert them a little bit and say, instead, because they took our toy, we just need to pick a new toy out that we can play with. Or we can even model for them language if they are close to understanding, and if they are actually playing with other children, we can ask the child for them. We can say, this is how we ask for our toy back. So what we want to do is model that behavior. And actually, just taking a step forward, I don't even know if Tracy says this in the book, but what I've heard before too is it's helpful to role play that as well. So even if your child is just playing alone with you at home or with a sibling, and that this happens to be a common problem when someone takes their toy, you can just sit down and be like, hey, let's role play, let's practice this right behavior here at home when it's not actually happening to us. And you tell me what you're supposed to say if I take your toy. So that's another step further that you probably would do with a slightly older child, probably closer to 2, who can kind of understand that it's a role-playing situation and who can practice that right response. But children really learn from repetition. So even if we are sitting with them and constantly telling them, constantly explaining their emotions, constantly physically intervening, and constantly telling them the right response, we are doing a lot of seed planting there. So even if it feels like we have to tell them a million times, it is working. It will work. We'll see the fruit of it someday. It might not seem like it in the moment, but that's the way that we should always kind of structure our behavior remodeling. And something you should do with that acronym is consider your child's age. So like I said, it kind of depends on where your child is in their development and what skills they have. But the first age range that we want to look at is 12 to 18 months. We should not expect our child between 12 and 18 months to have good self-control. If we ask them to wait a second, they're not going to be able to wait a second. They're not going to necessarily understand the command, and they're not going to be able to sit there patiently. They also have a lot of new abilities that they've discovered. So whether that's throwing things, or that they can hit things, or even just walking, those are things that we want them to practice within safe boundaries and with safe limitations. What we do at this age is we want to introduce boundaries between 12 and 18 months by going through that acronym FIT, and that's how we can best teach those boundaries. They will test them. They will not be very good at following them, but as we continue to enforce them and continue to repeat them as they grow, they will actually understand them once they're at an older age. So the next age group is 18 months to 2 years. Usually around this time, parents will say that their child has just grown up. They have more of a greater sense of self. They actually have more self-control with that as well. And they actually understand boundaries better. So they might not be perfect, but as long as we've been teaching them consistently, they'll start to pick up and you'll see, oh, I think they actually are getting it. But unfortunately, 2 to 3 years comes, and that's the terrible twos. And you might see just like a total dramatic shift in your child. That's what people are talking about. They might push back on the things that you've been teaching them. They might really test your limits. They're going to have a lot more desire for independence and desire to do what they want. But we have to remember that we are the emotional role model for our child. So we need to continue to enforce these things because it will stick. We just have to work hard, work through it, and we need to remain objective to teach them how to behave in those situations. A tip that Tracy says for kids that are 2 to 3 years old is to limit TV and screen time. Even in 2004, when she wrote this book, she was saying she doesn't know very many households where children don't have constant screen time. And I know that since 2004, it's probably doubled or tripled. The American Association of Pediatrics recommends no screen time for children under 2 years old, and even once they hit 2, it should be very limited. It can be extremely stimulating, and it can really rev up your child, especially if they are prone to being pretty overexcited. Also, something that can help at this age is to praise them for good behavior. So when you do notice those small moments, small and possibly few moments where your child is being kind and sharing, point that out and say, that's really great. Praise them for that. That's when they deserve the praise, and teach them, you just did that great behavior on your own. And you can even reference that. Remember earlier today when you shared your toy? Why don't you share this toy? And that will help them be like, oh, I can do the right thing. So they don't always feel like they're being wrong. So at this point in the chapter, Tracy goes through what she calls typical toddler transgressions. We've talked a little bit about things that, can happen in public, and we're just gonna go through the main 5 things that Tracy sees and ways that we can help our child with those behaviors. So the first and the biggest one that I'm sure we're all thinking of as toddlers are tantrums. So whether that's out in public, in a grocery store, at the park, at a friend's house, or even just at home, it's usually them kicking, screaming, they might be on the floor, pounding their fists, they're crying, and they're trying to get something, usually. Or they are having an emotional reaction to being told no for something they can't have. So if our child regularly has a tantrum in a certain place or at a certain time, we need to just take the time to plan ahead. I love this story that my mother-in-law tells me of my brother-in-law when they were all kids, that he would always throw a tantrum in the cereal aisle at the grocery store, to the point where she knew when it would happen. She would avoid the aisle as much as she could. They would only buy cereal for birthdays. So anytime it was one of their birthdays, they got to pick out their cereal for the day. So he knew that rule, but she also knew that he was always going to try to sneak his way around it. So whenever a tantrum did happen, her tactic was that she was just ready to abandon her entire cart of groceries and just leave and take him and be like, we're not going grocery shopping. I applaud her for that. I would not want to abandon my groceries, but she had to come to terms with that was the best way to teach him, and he did learn, obviously. She planned that ahead. Maybe it was just the mental preparation of, okay, I have to go grocery shopping later once my husband gets home from work without the kids, which might be a lot nicer and a lot easier. But I think of most of us, when we're at the grocery store and our cart is half full, we don't want to leave that behind. But even if we do expect that our child will throw a tantrum in the cereal aisle of the grocery store every single time, we can know our child well, and we can know what would help avoid that, whether if it's just avoiding the aisle, if they don't see it, maybe they shouldn't be allowed at the grocery store, or maybe we just can stick with a list. If we actually make a physical list and we say, no, it's not on our list, if that even just helps, we should be able to plan that ahead and figure out what's the best solution for our child, even if it does take us a few times to test it. The second behavior she lists, the second toddler transgression, is biting. So biting often won't start because of frustration. It might start at breastfeeding, because your child is experiencing teeth for the first time and they're like, what happens when I do this? And so it's usually a curiosity thing at first, but it can really get into aggressive behavior, but it can also be limit testing almost. So depending on your child, you kind of need to get to the root of what exactly is their intention to bite. It could be aggressive, it could be that they're trying to bite after a kid takes their toy, but they could just be play biting as well. My daughter's actually done this recently a few times, where she just will be playing. She loves pillow fights, so I'll pretend to hit her with a pillow, and then she'll just bite me, and she'll be laughing and biting me, and so I'm like, she's not mad, but it's almost like she's just trying to see, oh, can I do this? This might be fun. And I don't know, she might bite pillows or her stuffed animals or stuff. I'm not sure, I don't see her bite things really. But I just have to teach her, I want to stop that behavior before it turns into something more, or before she does it with anyone else. And so I had to teach her, I knew that the first time she bit me, that I shouldn't react, because if I go, ow, she might think it's funny when I make that sound. So I had to be oh, it hurt so bad. It left a mark on my arm, and I had to not say anything and be no, we don't do that. I think she bit me twice within a week, and she hasn't done it since. That was a few weeks ago. So I'm hoping that I enforce that behavior enough, but I am expecting to see it happen again in the future. So I'll have to study those situations where it might happen again and see what's up. But Tracy says something interesting about biting, is that biting often becomes something like your toddler is trying to gain control of the situation. So if you're, say, wiping your child's hands and face after a meal and they bite your hand, I think we all know kids hate being wiped. So they might just be trying to gain control of the situation, where they're like, I don't want you to do that. I'm gonna bite you. And so that's a perfect situation of if our child is old enough to verbally communicate, to teach them how to actually express what they're thinking, but also to prepare them. If we know that they might bite us when we wipe them, we should say, I need to wipe your face. And instead of trying to do it really fast, we might need to do it slower. We might need to come up with a fun way to do it or to involve them in it as well. But we really just need to study the root of the behavior, study the cause, and figure out the best solution to avoid another bite. Hitting and slapping is the third toddler transgression, and this is another behavior that can start off fairly innocent. It's usually when a child learns that they can hit someone and they get a reaction out of them. So I mentioned that earlier with my daughter hitting my face. I do think that the first time I probably did it, I was like, oh, I was kind of surprised, and I probably made a sound. And so I think she thinks it can be fun. But sometimes she'll do that too. She'll see my teeth or my tongue and be like really interested and try to grab it and like grab my mouth. It's not aggressive. It is just like a new skill. And so it's important that we try to give them another way to actually express their body movements at that age. If it is still at the innocent part where it's not becoming an aggressive thing, we can teach them that, you know, maybe they can slap. We have a piano. We've taught her how to, you know, kind of hit the keys a little bit. And so she can do that instead of hitting me. If she just wants to test out her strength, she can hit a pillow, she can hit things that aren't people. I've never had to completely redirect her. What I usually do is I grab her hand and tell her to be gentle, and that's something that I think is a useful tactic when hitting is an aggressive act as well. Additionally, if our children are verbal at that point, we have to teach them how to express their frustration and their anger and not have it manifest in a physical way of hurting someone. The fourth is throwing. That is usually a newfound skill that babies have where they start throwing stuff, and it can turn bad. A lot of times throwing will just be like a fun thing that they do, and then it can get to a point where they start to throw hard objects and they're actually really strong, and that's when parents realize, oh, this isn't good anymore. So Tracy gives an example. Actually, I don't even know if it's in this chapter, but she gives an example of a boy who was throwing things, and so she told his mother that she just needs to teach him when it's actually appropriate to throw things. So the only things he was allowed to throw were balls if they were outside. So she got him a whole bunch of outside balls that he could just throw around the yard. And I think that's really a great example because I do think throwing is a fun skill. My daughter will throw things. She's not very good at it, so I'm not concerned. Also, just look back at what you allowed your child to do when you first started feeding them solids. We've never let our daughter throw food, and so if throwing food is a problem, it might be less about the skill and more about a lack of table manners. So that can be something that you just need to enforce a little better at the table as well. Now the fifth toddler transgression is a little more unique. It actually has to do with hurting yourself. And this is difficult for parents because we don't want to see our children hurt themselves. So that could manifest in head banging, hair pulling, punching yourself, even scratching yourself. And that's usually probably during a tantrum-like episode, but when you can tell they're actually hurting themselves, you want them to stop immediately, and you might actually be more willing to give in to whatever they're demanding. It's a little more of an advanced tantrum in my opinion because your child is integrating a bunch of things that manipulate you and that test your emotions. A lot of times I think we can remain pretty impartial during a tantrum because we see it as a crazy behavior, but when it becomes personal and it's our child getting hurt doing this, our emotions come into play and it can be really difficult to remain objective. So the best thing to do is to provide a safe space for your child to carry on the tantrum until they are ready to actually have a conversation with you and to go through the FIT acronym. So Tracy gives an example of a child who I believe was head banging, if I'm right, and so instead of stopping him and giving him, they would physically move him onto a beanbag chair, and that's where he would finish his tantrum and he would not be allowed to come off the chair until he was totally done and he was ready to talk. So whatever it might be, we can just kind of create some safe boundaries around our child to stop them from hurting themselves, but to teach them that that behavior is not okay. And the last thing that we would want to do probably is like to pin them down or anything like that that might just aggravate them more. So we really just want to stay away from them while they're doing that behavior. We don't want to get hurt either. We don't want them to learn how to hurt us. So this can be a more difficult one if it's something you're experiencing, especially if it's a more complicated way that they might be hurting themselves. Then highly recommend you read that section in the book. But Tracy also does end this chapter with several, actually she just has several like stories just sprinkled in here of common behavioral problems. So if you are dealing with something specific that I didn't necessarily dive into in this video, please read the chapter in this book. It's amazing. And she does finish off the chapter by talking about what if my child can't help it? What if they've actually been diagnosed with a behavioral disorder or something that just keeps them from being able to have self-control or being able to understand and process their emotions or others' emotions. And that's something I would say largely if your child has been diagnosed with something, they likely might have a behavioral specialist. So that's something that hopefully a behavioral specialist would be teaching your child and teaching you how to deal with, so you can work together with them and they hopefully will have a lot of great tips for how you can help your child be better behaved. But what we don't want to do is write off those diagnoses as excuses for our child's behavior. Every child, to some degree, I would hope is capable of some sort of boundary, whether it is just a physical one, even if it's just protecting them from hurting themselves or protecting them from hurting others. Eventually they will learn. We just need to be consistent and help them along. Well, I hope you liked this video. It is definitely a tricky topic because toddlers can just change so much. Next week, we are going to finish off the book. We're going to do chapters 9 and 10, both in separate videos. Chapter 9, I'm very excited for its potty training. Tracy has a crazy strategy for it that I've been doing, so I'd love to speak about my experience with that. And then we'll be finishing off with chapter 10 and our 12 problem-solving solutions with every issue that might come up. So if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, comment below, and stay subscribed so you can be aware of those videos when they come out next week. Then shortly after that, I'm going to be making smaller, shorter videos that are just little tidbits of things throughout the book, of advice, of my personal experience of things. So if there's anything you'd like to see, just let me know below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.